Hi, this is Oliver, or also known as Improver on DeucesCracked. This video is a follow-up to last week's episode of the Thin Red Line, where I played some 200L on full tilt. You have since that posted some questions, and I'm going to try to respond to those questions in this video. I'm going to go over the hands one by one as they appeared in the video, and we're going to start off here with the ace deuce suited. Raise pre-flop, got called by JFS 25 here. On this screen here we do have some stats. We did not have those in the video, primarily because we had not played against these guys much before. Specifically, we hadn't played against JFS 25 here, so we don't really know much about his game. It's in the very beginning of the video. All we know about him is that he's got 113 and 40 cents to his name on this table, and probably therefore playing a lot of hands pre-flop, calling a very wide range. And yeah, so we raise and we get to see a flop. We flopped backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw, one overcard. It's a very nice hand to have in our bluff range against this type of player. There is one problem though, and that is that his range for calling this flop is going to be very wide. So we probably, in a lot of spots, have to barrel several streets. Now, on the turn here, well, on the flop I make it $8, so we're going to fold out his air a lot of the time here. So if he has complete nothing here, he's probably going to fold it, which is fine. A hand is not really strong enough to check call, therefore I prefer to bet this small amount to fold out his air, because I think that is the best way for us to, quote unquote, protect our equity, take the pot down. The guy here, he calls, and we see a turn card. Now, this turn card here brings us the most possible equity, I guess, without giving us an ace. And I'm probably going to barrel here, and I'm also going to barrel the river. Now, the question in the forum was why I wanted to barrel the river here, and you wrote some kind of range for villain. I don't think that we can say that villain here, he has something like 10-9 and King-Jack, Ace-Jack. I think that his range for calling this flop is much, much wider. He's going to have something like Jack-6 offsuit. He's going to have 10-7 offsuit. He's going to have Ace-3. He's going to have 5-3. He's going to have, well, 5-3 has two pair now, but a plethora of hands, and we don't necessarily know that he's going to fold them to a turn barrel. So therefore, in this spot here where we flop this much equity, I'm probably against an unknown gonna lean towards a triple barrel, because there are just so few hands in his preflop calling range that are really, really strong and can withstand a third barrel. And if he calls us on the river with, say, top pen or kicker, we know that about him, and we can proceed cautiously, a little bit more cautiously against him in the future. Also, if he calls the river with a 10 or something like that, we can be a little bit more cautious in the future. But I think it's a mistake to assume here that he's only going to call the turn with a strong hand, because he has so many hands in his preflop calling range, probably, and that just gives him, even for the turn, a pretty weak range on the river. So my idea here was to triple barrel against this guy on this flop. Now, the main thing here that I want to emphasize is that try not to project the range of hands that you would see this turn with onto the villain, specifically not when he's a half stacker. I think that's the end of it. So I would probably barrel any river card there. Maybe not if the 10 paired or the jack paired or the 5 paired or something like that. If the board pairs on the river, I could be slightly less happy about barreling, but I think most of the time I'll still be betting. Okay, so the next hand here is the ace-queen. We played against this guy opening on the gun. At this point, again, it's the beginning of the session. We don't know that he's playing very, very loose. If I knew that, I would probably be 3-betting the ace-queen here for value versus him. Here we just elect to call, which I think is very standard. I'll be 3-betting ace-queen against the under-the-gun open if I have an aggressive dynamic, or that I expect him to defend with a super wide range here, even though that my perceived 3-betting range versus his under-the-gun open should be fairly strong. So only against people who defend here very wide, or people who play back at me or just not giving me any respect, I would be 3-betting ace queen, or with, against a guy like Ikuru. Now with flop top pair, we don't know anything about him. We could lead here, but I think it's better just to take the more standard line here and check call. Check raising here is also an option, specifically when he bets it small. I can see some merit in check raising, but I thought that it was better for us to just check call here and see how he plays the turn, because that's going to be, probably make it a little bit easier for us to play against him in the future. We are pretty happy check calling here. So we check call, and the turn brings a 6, and he continues to bet small. At this point here, I put him on never a better hand than we have. I expect most people, they get greedy here and they have a hand that they can bet for value. So I think that he will be betting bigger here with queen jack or better. So here we'll put him on a draw or a weak mate hand. Actually, I think it's slightly more likely, or I think it's more reasonable, that we put him on a weak hand here that is looking to get a cheap river. Because if he had a draw and he was trying to make me fold something, he should be betting bigger, because I'm not going to fold much here to these $12. But since I was pretty sure that I had the best hand here, I decided to go for check raise. And I made it pretty small. I'm actually thinking this is a little bit too small. I think I should have made it something like 34, 36. Yeah, would have been fine. But then here he goes along and call, and the river brings a jack. Now the question now is whether we should bet or we should check here. I elected to go for a check call because I thought there was enough draws in villain's range, and I didn't really expect him to call a river bet here with an 8. So without knowing anything about him, I thought that it was okay for me to go for a check call. The fact that his range should be geared slightly more towards made hands, because he bets so small on the turn, and it's just me projecting some of my poker logic onto him, and whether or not that is true is hard to say. Anyway, being a little bit result-oriented here, villain ended up betting $58 on the river, and we ended up calling, and he had a busted draw. And we saw now that he had 4-3 offsuit opening under the gun, so his range for opening under the gun is very, very, very wide. The next hand is this hand here. At the same time, on another table, on a different table, I folded Jack 7 offsuit. On that table, the small blind was a fairly loose player that I expected to call with a lot of hands. Jack 7 offsuit versus a guy that's calling a lot of hands, where we probably have to barrel multiple streets, is not the best hand, because sure, we could be happy sometimes flopping a jack that we can value bet for a couple of streets, but we're not going to be excited that often. So therefore I folded that hand, because I didn't expect to take the blinds down that often, and I expected his range to be fairly wide, and not really being sure about whether or not I want to be barreling, and I would seldom be able to barrel with equity, so therefore I folded the Jack 7 offsuit. Here in the blinds we have a player, Saval 888 that he had been fairly aggressive with me in previous sessions, free betting me a fair bit pre-flop. Also been pretty aggressive post-flop, betting a lot when he had the initiative. And Juma here is also a regular in the games, but both I had in my mind tags here. When we see the stats here, we actually see that they're both nits. But I didn't have that in mind when I played this hand. I was putting them on rather taggish stats here, something like 21-17 or something like 3-betting, maybe versus me 7-8% or something like that. Juma a little bit less. So why am I opening this hand on the button? Well, I'm opening this hand on the button because I expect him to call with a range of hands that's very easy. It's very clear what range of hands they will have. They will have some medium string pocket pairs and some broadways. And against that range, I can play 4 deuce offsuit pretty much perfect in position. I don't need much equity when barreling or bluffing, because they're going to play pretty much fit a fold here out of position. Maybe this guy here is not going to be that happy to fold, but their range is going to be pretty much transparent to me. And if they're 3-bet pre-flop, sure, no problem. I don't expect him to be 3-betting that much that my raise here pre-flop is going to be minus EV in a vacuum. That being said, I do think I made a mistake here because I am in a any two cards mode, so I should probably have made it $5 here instead of 6, and that would have made the EV of this open slightly better. This spot here we got 3-bet, and yeah, we folded. So the next hand here is a pocket sixes hand that I like to defend in the small blind, and we see a flop. Now the question here is fold, call, or raise. And in the episode I said that I would either be folding or calling here and seldom check raising. The thing is, I don't know much about the 27-32 c-bet tendencies on mono flops like this in position. It does hit my range for calling from the small blind with some frequency. I have some pairs plus a flush draw, and some second pair and some top pairs here. Obviously I also have hands like, pocket sixes with no flush draw. And if I knew, for example, that Lee, he was betting his whole range here and then giving up on the turn, which could be very plausible, since I don't really look weak when I check call here. Oh, well, I do look somewhat weak, but I don't look like I have a hand that he's necessarily going to be able to barrel me off on the turn on a complete blank. Then I don't mind calling. The problem is here that, let's say he's betting pocket sevens with a diamond here. It's terrible for me because I then have to make him fold later on. I put myself in a spot where I have to make him fold a better hand that has some equity versus a lot of equity versus my hand, and that can check behind on the turn and catch a diamond on the river, and that just puts me in a terrible situation with this hand. Had it been two-tone or rainbow, I've been much more likely to call here because I do think that most of these guys are c-betting these kind of bolt taxes way too much, and we can then make an out of position float here with sixes with the intention of making them fold, say, pocket sevens, eights, nines later on, because we can rep something that we can value bet. And until they have seen that we're turning these hands into a bluff, it's going to be very hard for them to bluff catch on the river when we check call here and then lead the river after the turn goes check check. But here on this mono flop, with no information about how Lee plays these mono flops, I don't know if he's checking behind with these sevens that I mentioned earlier, or that he's betting his whole range here, or what he's doing. So there I like to just fold. Check raising here would, I guess, be an option, but it's not something that I'm normally doing here, because out of position check raising with no equity when called is generally only something I will do if I can check raise any two cards here, and then I'm just punishing him for having too much air in his range. And again, without information about how he plays mono flops, I think that's a bad idea. Against some players it's fine, but here I think it's a bad idea, and I actually kind of prefer out of position float, because we can rep slightly more hands, and the check call and when they check behind and river bet line here does make it, I think, has a higher EV than check raising. So yeah, here we just fold. Not much to say about that. Okay, the next hand here is probably the most interesting hand, or most interesting question in a sense. We have King 10. I raise it to $4 here. That's a mistake. I should make it 6 versus. We have DFS 25 here on the button, and we want to play a lot of hands with him when we have King 10. So 4 is too small. It's a misclick pre-flop. We get to see a mono flop here. This is a flop where DFS, he's going to have, again, a plethora of hands that he can call with, very weak hands. He's going to have some 6x hands like ace-6 offsuit, ace-4 offsuit. He's going to have ace-5 offsuit with the 5 of clubs. He's going to have a 7 of clubs sometimes. He's going to have a 10 of clubs sometimes in his hand. He's going to have a hand like 9-8. He's going to have ace-8. He's going to have... There's so many hand combinations here that he's going to continue with, but not many of them are going to be strong. So this is either a flop where I'm looking to check fold or barrel multiple streets. Now my King 10 here has a reasonable equity versus the range of hands that he's gonna call with. So I'm not super unhappy if he calls my bet here. And on a lot of turns, I can take this king 10 here, and if the turn is a king, I can value bet. If the turn is a 10, I can value bet. And on a king, on an ace or a queen or maybe a 9 or something like that, I can barrel, and often also barrel the river and make him fold his weak hand. So this is just a spot where we're again trying to punish JFS for seeing a flop with a wide range and not having many strong hands that he can call with. So here we bet, and he calls. Turn is a queen, and what I think confuse people, or sometimes confuse people, is the fact that a spot can be a good spot for us to be bluffing, and at the same time be a good spot for us to be value betting. And here on this river, which is against JFS a complete brick, against a tag not a good card to barrel because he has a lot of 2-pair or sets here, or straight. We have a spot where I would be betting probably any queen for sure. Pocket jack is very likely for value, but I'm also happy bluffing here with king 10 because I can make him fold maybe something like ace 4 or ace 6, or I can make him fold a bear club that he might be betting if I check to him. I don't have any showdown value really, so I will have some, but I'm not super happy about check calling here with king high, so I elected to barrel. And sometimes he's gonna call me with these weaker hands that I can get value from when I'm betting pocket jack, and sometimes he's gonna fold them. We again don't really know how tight he is on the river. Or when he gets to the river. It could be that he folds all marginal hands on the turn because he's just afraid, or it could be that he just folds all marginal hands already on the flop. We don't know. But the fact of the matter is that he's calling the flop with a super wide range, so if we are bluffing on the first place here with king 10 on the flop, we probably have to barrel multiple streets in order for that move to be plus EV in a vacuum. Now, I did make one mistake. And that's my river bet size. 55 here is way too big. I think that we can get the same amount of folds if we bet something like 42. So the mistake in this hand here is not necessarily the river bluff, it's more the bet size. And I think 42, just to name a lower number, is going to give us as many folds. I don't think that we should bet something like 18 here. Would just be to target his complete air hand. Here I'm also trying to make his fold his marginal mate hands that I definitely can see him fold here on the river. So just because a spot is a spot where we can both value bet thin doesn't necessarily make that it's a bad spot for us to bluff. It's not how it works. A spot where we can value bet thin just means that the range of hands that we can expect a villain to have, or expect a villain to potentially call with, against that range we have good equity. It does not mean that he needs to call with those hands all the time. He isn't put in a very tough spot here if he has something like ace 8, or if he has something like ace 6 here, or if he has a bear club. He's not never really rebluffing us here. I don't think so. I don't think that he's jamming here with a busted draw. So therefore, I think this is a good spot for us to bluff some percentage of the time, until that we know more about his game, more about which range of hands that he actually is going to see this river with here. It is sometimes a good spot for us to value bet, sometimes a good spot for us to bluff, and in this time here we had a hand that we couldn't really do much with other than try to make him fold. Giving up is an option, but then I think we should have given up already on the flop, and I think that is okay, but probably a little bit too weak because he's just seeing the flop with so many hands, so it's very hard for him to flop something strong. And there I prefer, when I have a reasonable amount of equity versus his weak made hands and weak draws, I prefer to just barrel instead of giving up. Had I had something like pocket deuces here, I would not have bet, because I cannot barrel with pocket deuces. When called, it's just pretty terrible. Here with the king 10, good stuff can happen. I can hit a king, I can hit a 10. That's much more favorable. This spot here, he called us on the river and he had the king high flush. Okay, so the next hand is the king 5 suited here, where we 3-bet and we flop top pair. We bet a little over half pot and we get raised. The question now is here, when we get to showdown here and we see that villain he has Queen Jack, a gut shot, whether that's going to affect the way that we're going to play against him in the future. Are we going to adjust our ranges and our assumptions about him? Well, first of all, he didn't really defend super wide here, so I can't really see, or I don't have any indication that 3-betting him with king 5 suited from the blind is going to be a mistake. I think that he's going to be folding the cutoff open a reasonable amount, and that we're going to be able to take it away from him post flop. One thing that we did learn about him is that he raised the gut shot here on this very dry flop, which is okay, but I think that what he's trying to do here is he's just trying to make us fold ace jack, ace queen. He can't really rep a hand that he's raising here for value. Most of the time I think these guys are going to be calling with king, queen, king, jack, a set of nines. Maybe he's raising king 9 if he has that in his range. I don't think that he does. So until I've seen that he's capable of raising these kind of king high dry flops, or generally dry flops that are relatively value heavy for value, in the sense that he wants me to spaz out here and jam ace queen, or jam something like jack 10, I don't think that there's any adjustments that we should be making. Maybe we can gear our 3-bet range versus him slightly more towards value when we add a position, because he has seen that we 3-bet, king 5 suited from the small blind. But I'm not necessarily sure that he's going to be super excited about calling a wider range and bluff raising more post flop. Because generally 200L guys they try to avoid sticky spots here, and Queen Jack suited is a fine call. Pre-flop I think it's okay, but I cannot really see him start calling here with hands like Jack 7 suited or something, with the intention of bluff raising us post flop, because he thinks that we have way too much air in our c-bet range. So I wouldn't really be concerned. Do I like his raise? Actually not, because once we called him here, sure, he should have, if he's raising here and he gets called, I think that he should continue barreling. Not necessarily because I think that we will, be super happy about folding, or we will be folding much, but it just doesn't really make sense, because he's just raising to see, he's just punishing us for having air here, and he needs to be afraid of us betting the turn with air in order for this raise to make sense. Because let's say that we have a hand like ace jack, 3-bet out of the blinds, get called, we see this flop, we decide to c-bet, he calls, turn brings a brick. Now, are we then betting here on this flop? What do we try to make him fold? He has a reasonable amount of king queen, king jack, 10-9, set of 9s, pocket 10s, pocket jacks, maybe queens, maybe aces in his range. We don't really know what wide he's defending. So on a blank turn, I don't think that there are that many hand combinations in villain's range that we can, conceivably try to make him fold. So I think it will be better off here just floating, but and then trying to take it away from us on the turn. If we bet again on this blank turn, half pot or something, yeah, he has queen high. He has to give us credit here. I don't think that he ever makes us fold a better hand, and yeah, he just have to be afraid that we're gonna be bluffing him later on. And I think calling here is fine, because sure, it's not the best gut shot here, because a 10 does hit his perceived range for calling a lot, so it could be a card that could slow us down. If he had something like Jack 10 here, then a queen could be more likely a card that we will be barreling, and we will sometimes be having 2-pair, and so his implied odds with that draw is a little bit better. So yeah, I'm not super in love with his raise. Anyway, I wouldn't make that many adjustments. Maybe gearing our range a little bit more towards value. So the next spot here is a little bit about positions and ranges. The question is, let's say that we were in villain's shoes and we saw this 9. Would we be betting ace king for value on the turn, given the current positions? The answer is probably no, because with the ace king here, we are blocking king queen, we're blocking some king jack hands which we could conceivably be getting value from. I don't necessarily think that there are many pocket jacks, pocket queens in villain's range that we can get value out of, and that just means that we're betting for protection versus spade draws and random floats. We're rather happier here check calling, I think, with ace king. Had we had aces, it's a little bit closer, but it's just a spot where it's very hard for us to rep a bluff, and therefore we cannot really bet for thin value. We should not really be bluffing much on this 9, because it does hit villain's range very hard for calling this flop. Queen jack gets there, and villain is probably in here with a fair bit of 10s, 10-9, and jack 10, ace 10, and so probably also king queen, king jack. So it's not a spot where we should be bluffing a lot, so therefore we cannot value bet thin. And ace king here is a pretty thin value bet given positions and perceived calling range on this flop. Now, if we put ourselves in a late position scenario where our pre-flop range is much wider, and there we can then have more bluffs in our range, and villain is probably also calling this flop slightly lighter, so therefore we can barrel or bet ace king for value a little bit better. But here, where we're under the gun, I think ace king is a pretty mandatory check against most people. I think actually it's minus EV to bet ace king here, because I don't expect to get called light. So what is most important is not necessarily that we have a laggy image, but also positions and the actual range of hands that we're opening, and the range of hands that we expect villains to be continuing with, and the amount of bluffs that we can represent. Here, when we are in somewhat early position, I don't expect to get called light on a turn, especially not this turn. I'll be a little bit happier betting again if the turn was more of a brick, like a 5, because then we could maybe rep something like ace queen, ace jack that we were barreling with, and we can also get some protection versus opening the straight draws that not got there, value protection and flush draws, and that would be happier betting. But here, when the opening the straight draws got there, we are not betting that thin for value on this turn. There are not that many bluffs in our range, so I think this is a reasonable spot for us to check call with ace king, and the bottom of our value range here is probably aces. I would not kill anybody for checking here with aces, with the intention of check calling. The problem is obviously that getting to showdown here on this flop can be pretty tough once we start checking the turn if villain is aggressive. But I don't think that there is enough light floats in villain's range that we need to worry about getting bluffed off the best hand too often. But it's it's a little bit close here. Our call on the flop here with the ace queen, I think, is pretty mandatory, because I think that people see bet this kind of flop a little bit too much, and then they give up a lot on the turn for the reason that I just mentioned. Would I call here with a lower pocket pair? Probably not, since the board is paired. If we change this flop here to something like king 10 deuce, there we'll sometimes call with pocket 7s, with the intention of sometimes taking it away later on, sometimes trying to get the showdown. Okay, so here we have the ace jack hand versus crazy dog. Raise on the button, and the question is here whether or not to bet the flop or check behind. We got some marginal showdown value. There are not that many worse hands that or better hands that we can make villain fold on this flop. So checking behind here, trying to hit one of our outs is an option, and we can also on some turn cards try to make it a late c-bet. The problem with checking behind here is that our hand does look like a weak king maybe, or something like a 7, or maybe pocket 8s that we're trying to get the showdown, for the same reasons that I just mentioned. The problem is specifically that we don't know how about Crazy Dunk, how he plays. Is he gonna be betting with pocket deuces, pocket threes, pocket fours, pocket sixes, if we check behind here, or is he trying to check, or is he gonna be bluffing here with similar hands to ours, or Jack 10, 10-9, 9-8? What is he gonna do? We don't know. So checking here and betting is relatively close. If it was King Queen 5, I would be happy at checking, actually, because our hand does not look as weak if we check behind there as it does on this flop here, where it looks like we have a weak made hand that he could very likely make us fold by betting turn, betting river. Now in this spot here, it goes check. He checked to us on this turn, and I start betting. Now the question is, do I want to bluff the river here if he calls? And the answer is yes. The reason is because I expect him to bet the turn here with most kings, or any king that he has in his range. I also expect him to sometimes bet a 10, and I think that his range for check calling here will be a 5, a 7, pocket 6s, maybe sometimes pocket deuces to pocket 4s, pocket 8s, pocket 9s, and if we bet turn, bet river, I do think that we can make him fold. Not necessarily because we rep that wider range, because if we roll back here, what are we really betting turn, betting river with that we're checking behind with on the flop? Yeah, it could be some air that we did not see bet the flop with, but I think that Crazy Dunk is not necessarily going to give us credit for a 10. He's more going to give us credit for, say, a king that we did not bet the flop with, that we try to induce some bluffs from him with, because not that often are we going to check behind here with air. And I think that if I were in his shoes and I had pocket 6s here, I would never fold. If a guy bets this turn, I would always call, because I would put him on specifically the hand that I have here, Ace Jack, Ace Queen, that he started to bet this turn with when he picked up some equity. It does not make sense for us to check behind here with a made hand very often and then start betting the turn. It could be that he puts us on a set of 10s that we did not bet the flop with, but fact of the matter is I'm probably betting pocket 10s on this flop for value, and I am almost always betting any king here, because there are so many weak bluff catches in Dylan's range that he can call maybe one, maybe two streets with. So here I actually think that if he has a made hand here, he should not fold to the turn on the turn, and he should also not fold the river. That said, I would have bet the river, because I don't think that he is thinking on that level. Time pressure, etc., maybe away from the table. And yeah, so I would have bet turn, bet river here for sure. Okay, next hand here. Flat versus undefeatable. A pretty aggressive guy. I also think he plays some 400 now. Maybe not, but I do think he does that. We flop the world, more or less. And the question is, why am I not raising him? Well, first of all, obviously we got a ton of equity, so we can raise here, it's not bad. But undefeatable here, he's very aggressive. So I expect him to put us on a weak hand when we call here, and I expect him to try to barrel us, try to bluff us, try to make us fold on a lot of turn cards, and therefore there is more value in calling. Had he been more passive and probably not bluff that much, I can see a little bit more merit in raising here, because we do lose a fair bit of equity versus a large portion of his range for betting the flop, and we can get it in here, be reasonable happy. So a more passive guy, I don't mind raising. Calling is also fine. I prefer much more raising here with, say, 7-6 of hearts, Jack 10 of spades, Queen Jack of clubs, or something like that. So hands that are not strong enough to call with. Here we got showdown value. We can call both the flop and the turn and be pretty happy about it, because we got a lot of equity versus any reasonable range. And yeah, that's why I'm not raising this hand on this spot here. So would I be raising against undefeatable if I had a set here, or two pair? Two pair maybe. A set probably never, or very very seldom. So my raising range on the flop will be super unbalanced, because I think there's more value in calling since he's aggressive. I think he'll be value betting a lot of blank turns and just holding out the bucket, and he'll be bluffing on, for example, the 6 here if he has King Jack with the King of Diamonds, and potentially also bluffing the river. Now he bets 28 here, and here we could make an argument maybe for raising, because we could rep something like pocket 5s that we're turning into a bluff, or 8-7 that we're turning into a partial bluff here, semi bluff. Obviously we also repping a flush, but raising here would be partly for value and partly for protection versus for example, the hands that he has with the Ace of Diamonds, King of Diamonds, Queen of Diamonds in his hand that we're losing to. And there is more merit into raising here if we think that he is less likely to bluff the river. I didn't know that about him, so I just called here and hope that he will bet the river with an overpair, value bet those, and sometimes also bluff on here on a blank river. Once I called, he checked the river, and when I bet, he unfortunately folded. So I think there's a very good chance that he had a complete air hand here that he did not want to barrel with. I do think that we will see some value bets from him with, say, pocket queens, pocket kings, pocket aces, and there we can call the river. Shoving the river is probably not plus EV, because I do think that we then mostly get looked up by flush draws. So I think I would just call the river. Anyway, so here calling or raising depends mostly on villain's tendencies. If he's aggressive, I like calling. If he's more passive, I don't mind raising. The last hand is this A6 offsuit, where we flat against FT1000, who is at this point established himself as a loose, slightly passive player. We flop a pair. We obviously could get very good odds pre-flop, that's why I'm calling, and he's opening enough hands that we can make a profitable call. And he decided to check behind. Here on the turn, I'm going to be betting my 6 for value and protection. He's going to be calling here with draws, be calling here with a queen. Whether or not I want to be betting the river or checking the river depends on the river card. If it's a club, I will be check calling. If it's a diamond, I'll be check folding. If it's if it's anything but a diamond, I will be check calling. Simply because I think that he will be calling here with diamond air. He could have air here on the flop. He picked up a diamond draw, or he had something like Jack 10, 10 9, or something like that. And on a lot of blank rivers, he's then gonna try to bluff with that hand. On a diamond, though, I think there's enough of Queen X hands and flush draws that he got there with that he will be value betting that I think it's better to check fold. So unless the river is a diamond, I'm gonna be check calling. If I know that he's not the type of guy to bluff with busted draws, then we can check fold the river. But until we have that established as an image or as a read on him, I think it's better for us to check call on those blanks. The reason that I'm happy, for example, check calling on a club is because I think he's going to be bluffing there a ton, trying to rep the club draw. And I think he has a tendency to forget that, I think he will forget that he is probably betting a club draw on the flop. So, therefore, I'll be more happy check calling than on a club. On a diamond, I'm a little less happy. He will be bluffing us there sometimes, but that's just the way life is. On any other card, I think it's better for us to just check call. Betting does not really, it's just because we're afraid of getting bluffed, and I don't think there's any value in betting, because I think most of the made hands that he has on this flop, like 6-5, that would beat 7-5, not 7-5, but 7-6, he's probably betting on the flop, and 9-6, he's probably also betting. So I don't think there are that many weaker made hands in his range that we can get value from. So therefore, I prefer check calling depending on or check folding depending on the river card. The last question was a question that was how deep do we have to be before we want to expand our calling range out of position versus a 3-bet. and it's not only related to stack size, but also to how good a read we have on villain's 3-bet range. The better read we have on villain's 3-bet range, the more hands that we can defend with. Simply because there are more hands that where it's going to be easier for us to play perfectly post-flop, because we know what kind of hands villain can have and how he likes to play them. But as a rule of thumb, it's not a good idea to defend out of position until we got a good read on the range of hands that the winners are 3-betting. So it's not only related to stack size. I will have to say that unless that we got odds to set mine, I will not be expanding my calling range out of position until I think that I got a good enough understanding on villain's 3-bet range that I can profitably call. And his range has, first of all, unless we are set mining, has to be very wide, so that he has a lot of air hands in his range, because otherwise there's not much idea of calling in the first place. If he's only 3-betting for value, there are not that many hands that we can defend with, no matter what stack sizes are. Just calling out of position, hoping to flop 2-pair, we need to be very, very deep. We also need to be very deep in order to call out of position with, say, suited connectors versus a relatively strong range. This is just the way it is from a mathematical point of view. On the other hand, if he has a very wide range, and generally if he has a polarized range, or for example we know that he's 3-betting small pocket pairs versus our cutoff open because he does not like to call in position with those hands, then there are more hands that we can play, because his range then for c-betting a lot of spots is going to make it profitable for the bluff catch, because he will be betting too many hands with no equity when called. But as a rule of thumb, I do not advise that any of you guys expand your pre-flop calling range versus 3-bet until you got a good read on the range of hands that villain is 3-betting, and that requires that you're paying a lot of attention and you're playing with him, more than just one session. And B is potentially deep enough that you can set mine versus his range, but there you have to be a little bit careful about how wide his range is, because as soon as his range gets wide, it doesn't really matter that he's deep. If he's just not bluffing much post-flop or something like that, or pot controlling a ton post-flop, you don't get paid off anyway if you flop a set, so it's not super profitable to start calling anyway. So out of position, I would not defend wide until I have a good idea of how villain plays post-flop. When you have a good idea of how he plays post-flop, I could see myself defend a little bit wider. In the beginning, I can see myself sometimes calling with, say, ace-queen, king-queen suited, sometimes hands like ace-jack suited, something that can flop top pair in a 3-bet pot, and then flop something where I expect villain to be bluffing at least some frequency of the time. Until I have that information, I actually prefer to expand my value range for 3-betting pre-flop or 4-betting pre-flop. So start getting it in with pocket 8s, pocket 9s if it's a problem that he's 3-betting a lot, or getting it in with ace-queen, simply because that is slightly easier out of position. Until that you got a good idea of how villain is playing. If he's 3-betting like a maniac, like 20% or something, then we can talk about calling. But there are very few players like that, and against them it's probably even more plus EV for us to 4-bet bluff them with some frequency pre-flop. So I'm not super happy about defending out of position versus 3-bet. I'm more likely to 4-bet or fold. Yeah. I think that's what I have to say about that. Now, I did play a little bit more, as some of you guys can see. Logged probably 3,000 hands since I made the video. I was actually contemplating, making 10 buy-ins without showdown before making this video, but I didn't have the time to do so. So, yeah, I did make 12 and a half, and also won a little bit with my blue line. The graph looks roughly like this over the days, and for the hands we see that it's a little bit more swingy, but the red line goes up and the blue line goes more like a little bit like a heart rate, and yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and I hope that you guys learned something. If you have questions to this video, feel free to post them in the forum, and I'll try to get around responding to them as soon as I have a little bit of time. Anyways, this was Oliver for DeucesCracked, making a follow-up video for Thin Red Line episode 6. I hope you guys liked it. If you have any more questions, post them, and yeah, be careful out there.